talking about metadata, and I'm going to be showing some existing examples of metadata. I know these two guys are going to yell at me because the examples are in 2010. However, it doesn't matter because metadata is the same in 2010, in 2007, and in 2013. It works the same way. So it doesn't matter which ones I show you. The one I'm going to yes, thank you. The one I'm going to show you first is the one where we have all of our newsletters. And a couple of other reasons why I want to show some of these things is to, again, emphasize some of the sites that we talked about earlier. We do have a newsletter, and the newsletter, if you want to sign up for it, if you've not already signed up for it, it's at portalproject@ocps.net, and in the upper right-hand corner, you put in your email address and subscribe. But the other part that we really want to go to for this presentation is actually down here in the navigation on the left. Web Services Newsletter Index, and there's also a newsletter archive. Don't worry about the index for right now. That's something where we just keep track of individual articles, and that's done as a manual process. But if you go to the newsletter archive, you're going to see a page that basically looks like, I didn't want to go back there. It basically looks like this, where you have a year and then the individual newsletters within that year. So we have 2009, 2010, 2011, it goes down a little bit further, 2012, and 2013. This particular page consists of only a single web part in the center. It's not individual pages. I never touch this page. Every time I put a new newsletter up every month, I never edit this page. It's automatically updated. So it saves me some time. I don't have to worry about it. And as long as I name things consistently and follow a pattern, everything will work the way I expect it to. And that's what I'm going to try to show you. How it's important. Your naming convention is important. The metadata that's associated with that file is going to be important. And if you do that, and if you have pages that work off of those libraries, you'll never have to touch those pages again.
And we're going to be doing this exact same thing when we work on the newsletter page.
I know.
Okay, I just wanted to know.
Okay, Mike Adani wants you to know that he's going to be covering how to do a newsletter page with the web parts. So, but what I wanted to emphasize here is the metadata that's associated with it, and then he'll show you the details of how to build a page where it's displaying the newsletter. So we're using something called a content query web part, and he's going to show you more about the content query web part a little bit later. But the thing that's important is I'm using two columns of metadata. The first column of metadata that I'm going to be using is the year. You'll see that everything is grouped by year, 2009, 2010, and so forth. So that's one piece of metadata. The other column of metadata is the file type. Now, what I'm displaying is only the PDF files for each of the months out of these years. But there are other files in the library. So let me take you to the library and show you what the data actually looks like. And even in the library, the view that I'm using in the library does break up all the files by year, one of the pieces of metadata, which when you go in and you define your lists, you can actually have as a default list definition special lists that are filtered or grouped by some of your metadata. Now in this particular case, as I go across the top and look at the data, everything is either a PDF or a Word document. Now this is a very special library, granted. This is where all of our newsletters are. Actually, it's not even a Word document. It's a publisher, Microsoft Publisher document. So even though all the documents are in this library, only the PDF showed up. And the reason only the PDF showed up, if you look at the second to the last column, it says category. And you go down and look at the list, it's either newsletter or source, and there's one at the top which doesn't have anything. And that's the one that's used as the current newsletter. It's always the one that gets displayed as the current newsletter on a separate page, and Mike will go into that a little bit later. But even though it's a PDF, I don't want it to be included a second time. So therefore I left it blank. I could have given it a different name, didn't matter. As long as it's a unique value, that's all that really matters, because the content query web part is going to use the category column as a filter. And it's basically going to say category equals newsletter. There are no other folders in here. If you go down through the list, there's no folders in this library. You might have in the past considered putting all the data in maybe separate folders, maybe a folder for each year, maybe a folder for newsletter versus source files. You might have had a couple different ways of sorting things, but there's no folders at all. And we'll show you some others that are a little bit more complex than this that don't have folders. Going back and magnifying it back again. Also, you'll see another piece of metadata at the end of the year. That's what year the page is actually going to, or that particular document is going to appear in. So all these files that are sitting out here in this library, they're all in one place. I don't lose anything. If you have a site, and this happens a lot on your outward-facing sites, I'm not saying you in particular, but I'm saying in general, everybody that's using SharePoint within OCPS, they'll create a PDF document and they'll put it out on their site, whether it's one of the departments here or whatever. And the person leaves the department. And then someone else has to come in and they have to make a change to that particular document. And they can't find the source, because the source was stored somewhere else. The source might have been on that person's desktop computer. When that person left the department, their desktop computer was wiped. What do you think happened to the source file? It's gone. So now if you have to make changes, you have to recreate the whole thing from scratch. So what we've been doing and what we've been recommending people to do when they create any of these libraries is to put the source file and the final file that you're displaying in the same library and use metadata so that it picks up the right ones. Now, since we don't normally give people access to the libraries, we're giving them access to a page that displays the information, but not to the library. They never know that all this stuff exists. It's there, it's behind the scenes. But this way, if someone has to go back and modify a newsletter and all of us are gone for whatever reason, they'll be able to go in and get the source files because they're in the same library. Now, this is a relatively simple one. I'm using this one to get started. Any questions about this one? Let's kick it up one notch. I'm going to go to the Portal Help page. Our Portal Help site. Our Portal Help site has a lot of different pages, including when you go to documentation. The flyout from documentation shows several different pages, everything from collaboration, general documentation, internet, intranet, school-related files, and so forth. Some of the things that are on these pages are individual pages that just are links. Other things refer to our documents. We have over 100 documents that we've created over the years, and they exist in various sub-pages. For instance, if I just click on documentation by itself, it's going to bring up the general documents. And you see a list of general documents here, and it's broken down into groups again, sort of like when we broke down years. Okay? But instead of being years here, it's actually a name, a type of document. So we have advanced concept documents, copyright information, governance, collaboration for schools, and so forth, going down through this list. There's basically a series of different options that the user could select from in order to categorize where the documentation should be within the page. But if you look at this page, it looks a little bit different than if I go to one of the other pages. Let's go to schools. Very different look. Matter of fact, it fits on one page in this case, but the individual column headings for the groupings are a little different. So every page that you go to, there's going to be some things that are shared, some things that are going to be different. Not only are some of the column headings the same, but some of the documents themselves are the same. So some documents appear on only one page, some documents appear on 2, 3, or maybe even more pages. But yet we only want to store the document one time. One of the things that we encounter when we start looking at some departments and what they were doing with their documents is that if they had a document that was going to be on multiple pages of their site, they stored the file multiple times. Not a good thing. Not a good thing, because if you're storing the document multiple times and you make a change to one of the versions, Are you going to always remember all the other locations you have to change? Not likely. So we only want to store the document once, but yet we want it to appear on multiple pages. And again, this is a single web part. This is not multiple web parts. So what we wanted to do was to have a way of getting the data using metadata so that it only displays what we want where we want it. So I'm going to take a look at what the metadata looks like in this one. So we have the name and the title. Every document that you store in a library, every image that you store in a library, actually anything that you put in a library, has a name and a title. The name is the same as the physical name of the file when you uploaded it. The title is something that you create. By default, it's blank. There's nothing there. But if you want to give it an alternate name, think of it as an alias. You define a title. Now, oftentimes you have a very short name and a relatively long title to make it more descriptive. In this case, this is the reverse. I have a relatively long name and a short title. And that's because I wanted these documents to appear in 3 columns, and I didn't want it to wrap over multiple lines all the time. So I wanted the title to be relatively short. The next column is category, and that is a metadata column, as opposed to the first 2, which are part of every library. And you'll see governance there at the very beginning, and I'd have to scroll down to see some others. So you can see here after governance, there's some how-to guides, some web part guides, ad-related guides, tips and tricks, how-to guides, site-based SharePoint, what's new, and so forth. So these are my different categories. This determines where on the page it appears. It's the grouping, how I'm going to group my documents within the page. And I'll stay here on where I'm at right now because it'll be fine, but this last column is going to give me the document type. Now, I call it document type just like I called the other column category, but it really doesn't matter what the name of the column is because no one else sees it. You see it. When you define the web part, you'd have to know what the name of the column is, but the end user never sees it. So it really doesn't matter to them what you call it. You can call it ABC, and they wouldn't really know or care. I'm calling it document type, and in this case, you see along the right-hand side, some of them just have a single item like the word general. That means that particular document appears on the general page, and only the general page. The third one down has collaboration, internet, intranet, schools, general, SharePoint 2010. It appears on 5 pages. Now what the content query web part allows you to do when you use filter, you can use a connector called contains as opposed to equals. If I were to say that it has to be equal to something, then any place where I had multiple names, it would never find a match, unless I was looking for all 5. But because I say it has to contain general, then it will get that first item, will get the second item, it'll get that one that's on 5 pages because inside those 5 pages you see the word general. Okay, so you got to be a little bit careful about the way you name things. You can't accidentally use a word that's also included somewhere else. So I could not have general school documents and general district documents and then search on the word general, because we get both. Internet, intranet, schools, the next 2 down, appear on 2 pages, and then the last one, collaboration, internet, intranet, schools, general, appears on 4 pages. So you can see I can customize it any way I want. I can have the document appear any number of places that I want. So this is another way that you can use metadata in order to categorize things. And we talked a little bit before, I don't remember if it was Hector or Mike, one of the two, talked to you about when you're building some of your lists, you have radio buttons and checkboxes. Radio buttons allow you to make a single choice, typically, only one item. And that comes from the old style radios that used to be in cars where you press the little buttons. And when you press one button, the other buttons would all pop out, so you couldn't have more than one station on at once. Checkboxes allow you to have multiple items selected. And basically that last column is a checkbox so that I can select multiple. And I'll show you that in a second. But before I do that, I want to mention one other thing. I think what they showed you before was just using a choice box. Well, when I first created this, and I created the column, actually, I'm going to go back up to the top. When I created the category column, I didn't create it correctly, and I've left it this way. Because I left it this way to prove a point. I'm going to go to one of the other pages. I'm going to show you something that I think causes a problem. You see in the center, I have tips and tricks and tips and tricks. It's the same category, but it's spelled different. In case you don't spot it right away, one has an ampersand and the other has the word "and" spelled out. Computers are very literal. As far as it's concerned, those are two different titles. It doesn't know. And because I used just a text box to enter things, it was easy to forget which way I chose to enter the value. As a result, on this particular page, you see two headings, which really should be one. That's the potential problem of letting users type in things when you're using this as metadata. If you're using a column as metadata, you want to try to limit the values that the end user can select. And to do that, you use a choice or a lookup. Don't allow them to enter the data directly. So I'm going to take a look at this particular list a little bit more closely. I'm going to library and library settings. And again, all this is the same no matter what version of SharePoint you're using. Come down to the columns. And in this case, since these columns already existed, I'm going to show you the existing ones. But if you were creating a new one, you would just add a new column with a new name and select the column type. But you see category is listed over here as a single line of text. And if you look at the definition, it's really all it is. It's a single line of text. And because this column already existed, it's not going to give you a lot of options to convert it to something else. SharePoint really doesn't like to convert a single line of text to anything else because it doesn't really know if it can do it across all the data. So you're basically stuck with it once you define it as a single line of text. But the real problem is that there's no control over what the user enters. What you probably should have done, I'm going to just cancel this, and I'm going to pretend I'm going to be adding another column. I'm going to call it category 2. What I should have probably done at the very least is make it a choice type. And once you decide that you want to use a choice type, you're going to have options down here to put those choices in. And you would put the information in here. And I'm not going to go through the rest. You get the point. You put in what you want to use. Don't allow the users to make assumptions and put in something that's spelled a little differently than what you originally expected. Now also over here on this side, there's a couple of other options which useful to look at. Require this column to contain information. If it's a choice box, typically I would say yes, because you want them to select at least one item. Otherwise, it doesn't appear in any of the normal categories. Is it possible to have a blank category? Sure, you can. But that means that probably someone didn't go around to define what that category should be. Do you want to enforce unique values? No. If I created a definition for a column like this, and I tried to enforce unique values, I could have 3 records, and that was it. Because I only have 3 values. So it's kind of, I'm not sure why Microsoft has that as an option. It really doesn't make sense. The display choice using, let me scroll down a little bit first. Bring it up to the top. Display choice using either a drop-down menu or a radio button. You've heard a little bit before about these two. I take it one step further. I basically use the following rule. If you've got 6 items or less, then having radio buttons is okay, because they're not going to take that much space. If you want to use a drop-down menu, that's fine as well. It takes a little bit less space. It's only a single row. If you have more than 6 items, I almost always go to the drop-down menu. Because if you had 100 items, do you want to really have your screen scroll for 100 items? Kind of be inconvenient. So I generally don't want to use 100 items with a radio button. That's my preference. You can decide to split it any way you want. And then checkboxes always display all the individual items. So if you actually had 100 possible items, yeah, you would have 100 rows that they would have to pick from. So it may not be the best way of doing it. I say may not be because there's another way that it could be done. But before I go and show you the other way, allow fill-in choices. That's the whole point of why I'm doing this. I don't want to allow fill-in choices. Because as soon as you allow fill-in choices, you're going to have spelling issues. I'm going to show you the results of a website. If any of you from a middle school or a high school, you know what I mean by the extracurricular activities report that they have to run and that they have to put data into the system. If you're from an elementary school, you have no idea maybe what I'm talking about. But I'll show you what it is a little bit in a few minutes. But when this first started about 2 years ago and they had to put in data, one of the things that they had to enter was their school name, because we didn't have it in a drop-down list. We should have, because they couldn't spell their own schools. They couldn't even spell the word school. We had records in the database that was going out that the public was looking at that spelled school S-C-H-O-L-S. So, it's not a very good thing to do to have that going out to the public that way. But that's because we didn't give them a drop-down list. Now, whether they really didn't know how to spell school or they just can't type, take it for whatever it means. But the point is that you can get misspellings, and misspellings can be either accidental because of just typing errors or because they really don't know how to spell something. So never allow fill-in choices, my opinion. Default value. Never use a default value. Now, here I have one that's shown. Now, generally, it's only our little group that does this. But generally, if I'm going to do this for another department, I'll leave I didn't want to have a one there. I'll leave the default value blank. Why? Because if you have a default value there and the person does not select something, you don't really know if the default value is what they wanted or if they just skipped over that particular column. Now that also applies to the yes/no field type. The yes/no field type, which was mentioned earlier, has mandatory a default value of yes or no. I don't care which one you select. You never truly know if the user actually selected something. So I almost never use the yes/no type. I'll go to the choice type with 3 values: blank, yes, and no. And it starts off with blank. That way I know that they've actually selected yes or no, not that it was an accident and they skipped over it. Now, it may not seem like a big deal, but if you have in some of the forms, and I don't know if any of Doug's forms had that much data in, but if you start getting 20, 30, 40 fields in a form, is it easy for someone to accidentally skip a question? Yes. So at that point, you start to wonder if all the data is truly correct or not. And as far as adding it to the default view, I'd always select that checkbox. I don't think there's any good reason not to have it selected for the default view. Now, one of the other things that you can do, and I'm going to create start to create another one I don't know if there's anything I can really put in on this particular table. I'll call it category 3. Maybe 4. We'll go 4. But I want you at least to see the setup for it is a lookup. Lookup differs from a choice in that it refers to another list. Instead of putting the definition of all the possible values in the definition of my column, all the values come from another list. The advantage to that is the following. You could have, if you have your list here set up with a choice field, only people who can edit the list can make a change to the values. And maybe that's what you want because that protects it. On the other hand, if you want other people to add values to the list, but you don't want them to modify the actual list definition, then by using a lookup, they can add values to the lookup, but not make changes to your list definition. So you have that possibility. The other possibility is if you had all of your values already in, say, an Excel spreadsheet, you can import data from an Excel spreadsheet into a list. And that's a pretty easy, pretty fast process. So if we had a list of all the schools, because we have 180 schools, I don't think anybody wants to sit there and type 180 schools in that choice box. But if we have 180 schools and we want to make it a fixed list for the user to select from, it is much easier to upload that list into a separate list and then from this list use it as a lookup. Plus the fact that we always are adding new schools. Every year we add more schools, right? It's pretty much a standard. So if you're adding more schools, is it easier to go in and modify a choice list, or is it easier to modify another separate SharePoint list? Most people would say it's easier to modify the SharePoint list. So anyway, the point is that you would come down here, you would have to specify which list you want to pull the data from. And the drop-down is going to give you all the possible lists that have data in them. And you would select the list that you wanted to use. And I'm just going to arbitrarily select one because I'm not going to go through this whole thing. We'll select this one called categories. Then I'll ask you which column do you want to use to be the column that you're displaying. And I'm going to say title. That's going to be the drop down that they're going to see, that column. So you probably, like there was one called ID, that was the one that came up initially. You probably don't want to show the ID because it's probably things like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, it's not the actual values. So you want to give them what the actual values are in the list. And then after they make a selection, you actually have some options about displaying some of the other data from that lookup table. So for instance, going back to that example where you had a list of all the schools, you might have it as another piece of information what the school number is, you know, the 4-digit number. You might also have the 3-character school name. You might also have the current principal of that school. You could include all that information by just checking the appropriate checkbox. I know this isn't the school list, but you could check which ones you want to display. And the word is really display, because when it shows in this particular list, it's going to be read-only, those additional fields. The only thing you'll be able to change is which school you're displaying. And then as soon as you change the school that you're displaying, it will update the display of the principal, the school number, and so forth. So that's the primary difference with a lookup. The last thing I'm going to show, and then we'll take a short break, is the settlement agreement site. And think of this as more of your general run-of-the-mill document library. Now, this happens to be data from a form, but think of it as being the same thing as a document library in some ways. In this particular case, we have things that start off with the name. of the file, the school name, which is probably one of the things that we're going to focus on, the principal at the school, the contact name, the club or organization, and going across as additional information about who when the tryout times are, tryout locations, the athletic director, and so forth. This information, if you were just to hunt for something for your school, might be intimidating, because for any 1 year, there's about 3,000 records. And hunting through to find your records for your school could take you a while. Even if you sort the data, it could still take you a while. Especially high schools. Some of the high schools have over 100, 200 records just for one high school. So if you really want to see something for a specific school, or even a specific coach at a school, how would you go about finding it other than scrolling through all the data? Because when you go down and look at the data, you scroll down the page, it's not going to show you all the records. Although we have this list set up to show you quite a few, but it's not going to necessarily show all the records. And even as I'm scrolling, it's not the way you want to look at it. It would take too long to find things. And this would be also true of a document library. If you had a document library with literally thousands of documents, and yes, we've seen departments that have done that had thousands of documents. So what we want to do is we want to first come up to the heading, and to the right of each heading is a drop-down box, which when you hover over the heading will appear, and it will populate with all the possible values in that particular column. So if we wanted to come down here and pick on a school like Winter Park, since it's a high school, even with Winter Park being a high school, look how many records there are. There are quite a few. You have to scroll quite a few pages to see them all. So now you might want to narrow it down a little bit further. Maybe there's a specific coach that you're looking for. Come down here and you say, okay, you're trying to find a specific coach. Let's take Coach Miller. I don't know who Coach Miller is, but we'll take Coach Miller, and it takes me right to the one file. That's what that one coach does. Did I have to search through a lot of records? Did I have to look through thousands of records to find that information? No. The same would be true of your document library. The trick in setting up your document library, if you want to call it a trick, is figuring out how do you categorize your information. And the easy answer to that is, if you were storing it in a normal folder structure, what were your folders going to be? So if this information were stored in a normal file structure with folders, very likely that you would have folders by school. Within that, you might have folders by individual coaches. You might have some of the other columns as well as individual folders. The problem with folders is I can search any way I want. For instance, if I don't want to include school, if I just want the coach, I can come back up here and get rid of the school name. I can clear that filter. And now I'm only really filtering on the coach. Now this coach hasn't been anywhere else at another school. But if this coach had been at another school, it would show me all the athletic activities that coach was associated with at any school that he was associated with within the data range of all the data that we have in the file. So if we had 5 years of data and this person moved to different schools during those 5 years, we would see all the activities that the coach was involved in. Now, if you go back to that previous scenario where you're storing things by folders and your primary folder was school, or maybe even before that, your primary folder was year, and then you had school as a subfolder, and then you had as a subfolder to that the coach, how would you go about finding where that coach was? You'd have to go through all the years and all the schools and look for all the coach folders and find out where they were. And that's the problem with folders. If you think in terms of your document libraries, if your document libraries are being looked at in more than one way, you can't define a file structure or folder structure that will help. Whereas when you work with metadata, you basically just select whichever column in whichever combination you want to find things. It makes things a lot easier to find your documents. Now, about 2 years ago, I think it was about 2 years ago, we start taking the grants department paperless. They don't use paper anymore. They don't store the grants information on paper. They may get it initially on paper from whoever's giving the grant, but they immediately convert it to electronic form. And instead of passing out a physical paper document to easily a half a dozen or more departments. Now they just have a library and they send out a link to the file. That's it, just a link. Not even sending the whole document. Because you're sending a whole document, that could be several megabytes in size, and that's tying up Exchange, it's tying up people's mailboxes, it's just causing all sorts of problems. So all you do is wind up sending out a link. And when I say sending out a link, if I go back to one of these other folders where we had some documents, to get the link, all I have to do is right click on it. There's an option that says copy shortcut. That shortcut is the link to that specific file. Copy the shortcut, go into Outlook, paste it inside the text area of your Outlook email message, and that's all you send to the people. You don't send the whole document. You send the link. When they click on the link on the email, it takes them immediately to the document. So basically what I'm trying to get at with the explanation here of all this metadata is that metadata will help you find things faster. It'll help your school go paperless. You heard what Doug said. Too bad he wasn't here today to tell you in person. But he's been able to take Freedom Middle paperless. Now the big question is, how long is it going to take him to get West Orange paperless? Because he will. Guarantee it. He'll do it. And he's not going to give him a choice. But the whole point that you want to get to is where you can start to classify your documents like this using metadata. You don't need hundreds of columns. Usually, 3 or 4 are adequate. And those 3 or 4 will be enough that people will be able to find the documents very quickly. And you just, at that point, don't have to worry about folders anymore. You don't have to worry about having duplicates of files. You don't have to worry about people calling you up and saying, yeah, I'm looking for such and such a file, but I have no idea where it's stored. Because all they have to do is search by the metadata. Any questions before we take a break? When you get ready to use metadata, if you'd like, we have open labs. We do them roughly every month. Usually it's the first Monday of the month, although in August I think it's a Wednesday or something. I don't think it's a Monday. I think it's a Wednesday because we couldn't get Monday. Normally it's the second Monday of the month, but check and sign me up. You'll be listed there. Come to one of our open labs and give us some idea what you want to do with your libraries, and we'll come back with some suggestions of what metadata might be appropriate to help make it work. Because we work with grants, and I tell you right now, grants couldn't be happier that they don't have to have all this paper. They basically had a room, I don't know what we say, it was about a 20 by 20 room, surrounded with file cabinets all around the outside. Well, over 3 years, that's all going away. They're not doing anything with the older records, but everything new for the last 2 years and going forward that comes in is all electronic. So those file cabinets are going to eventually disappear, and they're going to have a conference room when they're done. So think about it, and when you're ready, come to one of our open labs and we'll take you a little bit further into this and let you see if you can do the same thing that Doug's done and that Grants has done and Title I is in the process of doing now, going paperless. So that's basically